I thought I'd take a few minutes and go over the endocrine system, just the basics for those of you that are a little bit more audio learners to help you learn how to study this system. This system is actually really, really fascinating. Uh, the idea is that you really need to understand what the hormone is doing, why it has the action that it does. In other words, how is it effectuating the changes, and then subsequently knowing what those hormones and their targets are, and why we have them, and what happens when they're abnormal. So, interestingly enough, the two regulatory systems in our body, the nervous system, the endocrine system, they both kind of work in conjunction and both have different um, goals in mind in that sense. The nervous system brings in sensory input and motor input and then takes that information and sends out an action or an inhibition, depending on what we're talking about. And that action is usually very quick. The nervous system has a very rapid response. However, that response is short-lived unless it's continually being submitted. And that goes for, all of the nervous system, really. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is more of a feedback mechanism type of system. Hormones are sent out to effectuate change. It takes longer to have those changes occur, but then those changes are more longer lasting. And it's the subsequent results of those hormones from the brain that then determine or give negative or positive feedback back to the brain. So that's one thing to look at as you're doing your reading and your understanding, is that the endocrine system is slower response, but a longer acting time, and often it controls itself by feedback mechanisms. Now, there are several different endocrine organs. Some are strictly endocrine organs, such as the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, as far as our system is concerned. Others have both endocrine and exocrine or paracrine functions, like the pancreas, and so some have other functions besides being endocrine glands, such as the testes and ovaries, have other functions in addition to hormones. And so really, an endocrine gland is any gland that's secreting a hormone. So the first question to review and to understand is, what is a hormone? A hormone has three things that make it a hormone, that by definition it has to have in order to be a hormone. One, it has to be released in small quantities. It can be either biorhythmically, so just is happening like a pulsatile fashion, or in response to a stimulus such as the adrenal gland and the sympathetic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So it can do it that way, or it can just be pulsatile in the sense that it just releases according to an individual's biorhythms. The second thing is it must travel through the bloodstream. So any chemical that's just going within itself, like in the nervous system, going from one synapse to another, isn't a hormone, even though we see that both epinephrine and norepinephrine act as hormones as well as neurotransmitters. So you can have more than one role, but in order to be a hormone, it must travel through the blood. And then thirdly, it must hit a target site that has a specific receptor for it. And so it's not just going out and doing, massive change. It's actually a very targeted response. And that's what makes up a hormone. Hormones are typically one of three types of chemical compositions. They are either lipid-based. Sometimes we refer to those as steroid hormones. Usually they have an ONE at the end of their name: aldosterone, testosterone, estrogen, corticosteroid, or sterone, which is also called a corticosteroid classification, like cortisol. So you have the lipid-based ones. Usually they're almost all derived from cholesterol. You have the protein or peptide-based, so strings of amino acids. They can be very small, like HCG, or very long and a little bit more complicated, like insulin. And finally, we have 4 hormones that are considered amino acid derivatives. So slightly different. That it will include T3, T4, and then epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those 4 hormones are really, in a chemical classification, amino acid derivatives. Now, why is it important to know the classification and what type of hormone we're looking at? Well, they have different effects. So, for example, lipid-based hormones, steroid hormones, have their effect at the cell nucleus. They increase mRNA, so they're increasing transcription, which then increases the production of proteins, which then changes what happens with, makes those changes. On the other hand, the protein or the protein or peptide-based hormones are have their effect at the cell membrane, and they usually utilize the second messenger systems like cyclic AMP or G protein to effectuate a change. So just like you've learned in 264, those second messenger systems then cause a cascade reaction, which then causes changes in the cell. And all peptide hormones are that way. In addition, so epinephrine and norepinephrine, as you learned in lab, or as you learned last semester in 264, also have their site of action at the cell membrane. T3, T4 act more like lipid hormones, where they have their site of action in the cell nucleus. So you need to kind of understand that about each hormone as well. And then finally, as we talk about different classifications and different modes, sometimes the abnormalities or the effects we see when things are not in homeostasis, that's an important role too. Are they peptide or lipid based? And so we'll get into that a little bit later. That's your basic overview. They're usually released in small quantities. Your study guides have some actual inclination of how much that's stored. The other thing that we see is how they're released, how they're transported. Once again, they all have to be transported through the blood, but you have a wonderful table in your, I think, third study guidance on hormones, and it talks about their different classes and some of those characteristics, including half-life and receptor type, and then some examples. I would suggest knowing that table really well. The other thing that I would suggest is in that same study guide, there are hormones from the hypothalamus and from the pituitary, giving you the hormone name, the target tissue, and what its primary action is. I think this is great. I always encouraged my students before we had this version of the course to make an Excel spreadsheet with that information and then carry it a little further, having what the target organ may be, and then what happens with a hypersecretion or a hyposecretion, so an oversecretion or an undersecretion. I'll try to find that as I continue talking. Of course, I don't don't do that very well. I can multitask in many other ways, but for some reason that's a lot harder for me to do, is to continue talking while I'm looking on the computer for something. So, having said that, though, I think it's important that you understand that's probably the easiest way to study those hormones is to use a spreadsheet, and to do so is sometimes can get a little convoluted. It can be very ginormous and may seem overwhelming, but I tell you, any other way seems to be harder to do. We used to do this right at the beginning. It was very hard to do at the beginning, and I think now at the end, having experienced a little hormones in almost every system, having understood the nervous system, which was really spent a lot of time at the end of the semester in 264, you're kind of seeing how it brings it all together. Now, this is what I'm referring to when I say a spreadsheet. This is how I used to have our students in the past create one. So I think the one you have in your study guide is great, and I would expand it if I were you. Spend a little bit more time with perhaps using some of these categories. This is entirely up to you, but not just the name and the type of hormone, so you know what kind of action it's going to have, what kind of characteristics it's going to have, where it's coming from, and then its site of action. And then once again, its action itself, its primary action, that's what you have now in the current study guide. I would make it a little bit bigger and include feedback. So what's causing it to slow down or to stop? Hypersecretion, what happens if it's too much? What happens if it's too little? Hyposecretion. And then in this case, we're back when we were using a text, I would have them reference it or page it. If you're using a reference text, that's wonderful to do, or if you have other things that help you with the characterization of that hormone, that's wonderful too. The reason I say that this is a good thing to do is because you're going to have a lot of little mini case studies on your fourth exam about hormones and what they symptoms, you may have to see a group of symptoms and determine what the disorder is, or you may have a disorder and need to know what the actions are and why they're, what's wrong with the feedback. And this is just really kind of helpful, I think. So just kind of keep that in mind. I want to just mention briefly before I share, probably a final document and then just talk a little bit about your focus, is you have to see the hypothalamus and the pituitary kind of like a business. That's how I see it. You have the hypothalamus is like the CEO. He's the big man or woman and makes those big decisions, tells the manager what to do. And then the manager, well, she's the one that goes and makes the work happen. Sometimes my brother refers to it also as in the military, where the officers make all the decisions, but it's really the sergeants and the working men and women that get things done. Anyway, so if you think of it that way, you can think the hypothalamus is really kind of controlling or telling the pituitary what to do. Pituitaries are those hormones that you really want to focus on and get the idea that is where the work happens, is when the pituitary sends it out to the rest of the cells. And I'll leave that at that for the moment. The other thing that's important, so focus, I guess the point is focus on the pituitary. Now there's a couple unique things about the pituitary, so pay attention to the posterior versus anterior pituitary. And there's probably 7 hormones that you should know from the anterior and posterior, including, let me just type these in. So ADH and oxytocin, that should be a capital H, by the way, from the posterior pituitary. And then you have LH, FSH, which are separate hormones, although they work in conjunction with each other in reproduction. We'll spend more time with that in the next module as well, so just so you're aware. Thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal gland, ACTH. You do need to know all the acronyms for them, by the way. That's how we talk about them. That's how we work with them. Prolactin. Let's see, that's 7. So at the very least, know those really well. There's a couple other ones that, and that's supposed to be ACTH, sorry, adrenal corticotropic hormone. So scratch that one, but the first one. But, those I think are important for you to know really well and know all about them really well. We spend more time talking about, in addition to T3 and T4, which are the thyroid hormones. They're produced in the thyroid. Know those. And parathyroid. We talked a little bit about that, I believe, in urinary because of the calcium balance. Or maybe, bone. And urinary, a little bit with calcium balance in there, parathyroid. And then, of course, aldosterone. It's hard to type so fast. Testosterone and cortisol, which is its common name. And then in the adrenal medulla, we have the epinephrine and norepinephrine still. And there's a bunch of, there's androgens also. Ooh, andrology I wrote because, I've worked there for 25 years. And so when I start writing andro, it just pops up andrology. But it's the androgens, which are the male sex hormones. Sorry about that. Androgens. Okay. So know all those fairly well. You're going to need to know the reproductive ones for your next module anyway. So get what you can from this module, the study of that, and then you'll see them in the next module much more in depth. Okay, let's see if there's anything else. Thyroid hormone regulation is an important thing to pay attention to as well. There's several figures there to show you about synthesis and how we function with that and what they do and their disorders. The same with the adrenal gland. There's a great picture of the adrenal gland that we use. So pay attention to those and then terms like Cushing's syndrome and Addison's disease and pheochromocytoma. We do also mention a little bit about insulin and glucagon, and diabetes, which we kind of went over already in the study guide, but this one gives you more information, so you still are held accountable for it. Glucagon and the pancreas. And someone has spelled pancreas the English way with an extra E. Here in America, usually spell it without the E. All right, so that's going to be it. If you have any additional questions, please let me know. And thanks for listening.